Today, as we drive north on the Italian A1 autostrada that connects Naples and Rome, there sits a landmark that is clearly more visible than all the rest. High on Monastery Hill sits one of Christianity's most sacred sites, the Abbey of Monte Cassino. This monastery symbolizes the resilience of the Christian faith. The abbey was destroyed and rebuilt 4 times, most recently during World War II in 1944. The Abbey of Monte Cassino has become a haunting reminder of one of the fiercest and most controversial battles in Italy. The Abbey of Monte Cassino was founded by Saint Benedict in 529 AD and became the model for monasteries in Western Europe. Benedict chose this site on top of 500 meters of solid rock as protection for his community. From the windows, one could see for miles in every direction. In 584, the Germanic people known as the Lombards attacked the abbey, and the surviving monks fled to Rome. The abbey was re-established more than a century later. In 883, it was burned down and rebuilt again. The monastery was destroyed again in 1349 by an earthquake. Pope Urban V was instrumental in its reconstruction. The new abbey was a vast complex of building with walls 20 feet thick. From below, the massive structure looked like a fortress. Italian artists helped the monastery become a Baroque masterpiece and a center for the arts. The archives contain many valuable historic manuscripts. But during World War II, the hill of Monte Cassino became the foundation for the German Gustav Line. The Allies had been victorious in North Africa and Sicily in 1943. They knew the next move must be to follow the retreating enemy through Italy. Hitler ordered his own troops to take control of Italy, and the Allies were surprised at the speed with which the Germans established their defenses. The Allies lacked a solid strategy for defeating the Germans. They found themselves in a conflict that offered few military advantages. Italy was never going to be the main focus for the Allies. Plans for an invasion of France had already begun. The Italian terrain was particularly suited to defensive warfare. The terrain's mountains and rivers provided ideal obstacles with which to form defensive lines. The Germans wanted to keep control of Italy as far south as possible and made excellent use of those river barriers and mountains to form the defensive belt known as the Gustav Line, which ran across Italy south of Rome. In the winter of 1943, the Allied plan was to reach the Gustav Line and continue driving northward to Rome. American Fifth Army divisions led by General Mark Clark were ordered to attack the town of Cassino in hopes of a German retreat and abandonment of the Gustav Line. This operation was made more difficult due to one of the most severe winters on record. The troops saw continuous rain, which brought crippling mud. Vehicles were unable to move in knee-deep muck, forcing ammunition and supplies to be carried up hillsides on the backs of mules and men. Troops also endured snow and sub-freezing temperatures.
The mud was terrible, and eventually we were supplied in the mountains either by mule train or backpack. And sometimes we didn't get supplies. We went one time without supplies for 3 days. And I found out how dirty snow is then. We put snow in our canteens, put the canteens under our armpits and thawed the water, and it's pretty black. You wouldn't believe that snow is pretty dirty. And we hunted out some cans we'd thrown away and licked them. So we'd have something. My buddy had a nickel candy bar. That's what we had for 3 days.
The First Battle of Monte Cassino began on January 17, 1944. With French and British troops, but neither could penetrate the Gustav Line. The Germans had used the previous 3 months to prepare their defensive positions and were ready for an assault. The Allies endured miserably cold and rainy weather. On January 22nd, an amphibious landing took place just north of the Gustav Line in the town of Anzio. The goal was to relieve pressure at Monte Cassino by placing 50,000 Allied troops behind the Germans and the Gustav Line. However, the troops at Anzio were stuck on their beachhead for 4 months and could provide no assistance to units at Monte Cassino. By February 11th, the Allies at Monte Cassino were forced to withdraw after almost 3 weeks of fruitless fighting and the loss of 2,200 men.
In January 1944, the Allies landed at Anzio, 65 miles northwest of here, in an attempt to turn the German line and cause them to abandon the Gustav Line. But the Germans contained the beachhead landings. By February of 1944, the German pressure against the Allies at Anzio caused the Allied forces to redouble their efforts at Cassino to force an opening into the Leary Valley. The Allied Second Corps was exhausted, and the Provisional New Zealand Corps, commanded by General Freyberg, with the 2nd New Zealand and 4th Indian Divisions under his control, entered the line to take up the task.
As early as July of 1943, discussions arose about the right and wrong of bombing the monastery. President Roosevelt wrote to Pope Pius XII, assuring the Vatican that churches and religious institutions will, to the extent it is within our power, be spared the devastations of war during the struggle ahead. 4 months later, General Eisenhower asked to have the abbey added to a list of protected monuments. At the same time, the Vatican received a letter from the British minister to the Holy See that if the Germans used the abbey as a defensive position, the Allies would have permission to attack the abbey. The Germans assured the Vatican that they were not using the abbey. However, the Allies were not convinced, so the decision was ultimately made to bomb the monastery. Leaflets were dropped on the monastery, warning the monks and a number of Italian refugees to evacuate the monastery.
We were pulled back to go in relief, and I watched the actual bombing. I've never seen so many planes in all my life. They came over wave after wave, and the whole hillside just erupted in flame and smoke. And it's amazing that a lot of it was still standing after that, even all that severe bombing.
The bombing began the morning of February 15th and lasted for 3.5 hours. American bombers dropped a total of 1,150 tons of explosives, reducing the abbey to a pile of rubble. The only people killed in the monastery were about 200 women and children seeking refuge. The destruction of the monastery gave the Allies no advantage, and the Germans quickly used the ruins to their advantage as a defensive position. Once again, they had not dented the Gustav Line. The third battle began on March 15th after the bombing had ceased. The New Zealand Corps attacked the town of Cassino from the north. The town was flattened by severe bombing, followed by an artillery attack of over 1,000 guns. The New Zealanders made their way into Cassino and captured Castle Hill between the town of Cassino and the monastery. By March 17th, the Gurkhas, soldiers of the British Army, were only 250 yards from the monastery at Hangman's Hill to the north. The Allied commanders felt that they were on the verge of success, but the Germans continued to reinforce their troops and defend the Gustav Line. However, the attack on Hangman's Hill was eventually repulsed by the determined German defenders, and the Allied attempt to cut off the German supply route had failed once again. It was during this extremely intense hand-to-hand fighting that an unusual compromise arose. In the middle of the battle, the Germans proposed a break in fighting to allow each side to collect their casualties. For precisely 2 hours on the 17th of March, not a shot was fired as both sides tended to their dead and wounded. When the ceasefire ended, both armies resumed the bitter struggle of 4 more days. The Gurkhas and New Zealanders were completely exhausted and the attack was called off. After 2 months of planning, the final battle began on May 11, 1944, under the darkness of night, with a massive artillery attack of over 1,000 guns. The next day, the British and Indian divisions crossed over the Rapido River south of Cassino. By the next morning, they had assembled a bridge over the river to allow other allies to cross and beat back German counterattacks. Meanwhile, for 3 days in the mountains above Cassino, Polish infantry attacks made little progress and brought heavy losses to both sides. However, on May 17th, the Polish division renewed their attack in the mountains. In the early morning of the next day, members of the Polish regiment found Monte Cassino abandoned. The success of the Allied crossing to the south had caused the Germans to abandon the Gustav Line the day before and reinforce secondary defensive lines farther north. The Poles raised a homemade flag over the ruins of the monastery as a symbol for their hard-fought victory. During the battles, Monte Cassino had become a symbol to both the Germans and the Allies. To the Germans, the monastery represented the steadfast determination that characterized the defense of the Italian Peninsula. To the Allies, the monastery symbolized a key obstacle in the march to take back Europe. Controversy still remains today over whether the bombing of the monastery was necessary. It is argued that the abbey's destruction was completely pointless. Some felt that it was crucial for Allied victory against a stubborn enemy. The monastery was rebuilt in the 1950s by the Italian state and is once again a working monastery. Today, there is little visual evidence of the conflict that took place here over 60 years ago.